Hey everybody, it's Roger Thorpe here, president of Thorpe Benefits. I am joined today by Chris Bonnett. Chris and I are going to have a very important conversation about the very interesting topic of National Pharmacare. As of this date today, November 8th, we are likely waiting for an announcement of some kind. But depending on when you're watching this, I think the conversation will help either way because we're going to try to hone in on some of the major issues. Before I throw the first question at you, Chris, do you want to tell the audience a little bit about yourself and where you're coming from in terms of this issue?
Yeah, I've got a lot of different perspectives on it, I suppose, partly because I spent half of my career inside the insurance industry, starting with underwriting and reinsurance, also, I guess, sales management, product development, and a number of different things within the industry. But I've been
Okay.
an independent consultant for over 20 years now as well. And part of my perspective on this was certainly formed by me going back to school, not once, but twice. And
Mm,
my doctoral thesis was in how Canada could get universal drug insurance. So everything pharmacare is kind of right on the nose as far as I'm concerned. It's an area of professional interest, of academic interest, and of personal interest, as it is, I think, to most people, because you can see
yeah,
yourself, like, we need access to stuff, and right now our patchwork doesn't really afford us that.
right. No, there is definitely relevance to this. It's good that this has come up for all of Canada. With that, thank you for that little intro in terms of your point of view on this. But let's start, I guess, with a fairly broad question first, and that is, what is National Pharmacare going to solve? And
Uh-huh.
then the follow-up to that, I guess, is, what would the main barrier be to getting this done, getting it all accomplished?
Right. Well, I think that what is it going to solve? That's a key question. And I honestly
Hmm.
don't know that governments have answered that. They've had all kinds of studies, reports, advisory boards, and councils, and so on. And I'm not sure that they've answered that really core question. My answer would be simply, we need to make sure that every Canadian has access to prescription drugs, to the
Hmm.
drugs they need in a timely manner. I think that ideally, that access has also got to be comprehensive. One model is that you'd have an essential medicines list, about 125 drugs. That
Hmm.
won't solve the problem for very many Canadians. It's helpful. I don't even think it's worth starting there. I would rather go to something bigger. So, universal and comprehensive, those are the problems because we have an unknown number of Canadians really with no coverage, but far more with not enough coverage. And that, to me,
Okay.
is the core issue. Getting people enough coverage, whether they've got a cancer diagnosis, whether they've got a rare disease, whether they just got complex health issues and just need a lot of different drugs that all add up to a lot of cost. I think the
Okay.
barriers are related to that. Um, the barriers are political will. Part of what I studied at school was the fact that the federal government first proposed a national drug insurance plan right at the end of World War II. Just about the time the UK was doing its National Health Service, we were talking about a prescription drug plan, but it never got any further. And I counted 8 or 9 different occasions just in my lifetime that the issue has come up. So political will is a problem. I think the other thing, the reality right now is public attention to this issue because there's 1,000 other things like affordability, housing, wars, climate, you name it. And most people have drug insurance either through their employer because they're a dependent of an employee that has coverage or from a province. So on the surface, the people that are the noisiest, the ones that have the most sway and power already have drug insurance. So this is not a key issue for them. I think the other thing clearly is cost. Um,
Hmm.
Drug insurance is expensive. It's getting more expensive all the time on a per capita basis, but those costs are not evenly spread. Some people spend a lot of money on drugs. Some of us, hopefully and gratefully, don't spend very much because we don't need them. So cost is still an issue. It was a cost. Cost has been an issue for governments since at least the 1960s,
Right.
when there was a royal commission on this, and it was, well, we'll do pharmacare later because we need to study this cost issue a little more.
Okay, that's perfect segue to the next question. We can get into that. So, No one seems to talk very much really about how much the overall program could cost. I know the PBO put out a report which our viewers may want access to, and they can get that from us if they
Yeah.
like. But what issues in terms of that report and the layout of the cost of this? What flaws do you potentially see in the math potentially in that? I think that's a good
Right.
question to address.
Well, yeah. So if there's an actuary in the crowd, they do a lot of costing models. And that's what the PBO report, it's a model, and all models have assumptions. And if those assumptions are violated, then the bottom line, the endpoint is has to change. And I think that's the challenge. PBO was given a model by the House of Commons Standing Committee on Health a few years ago, and they basically just used the same model this time to update their costs and project them a little further forward. So the first reality, of course, is that it's going to be a universal plan. That's great, no problem with that. Second reality is they want to use a relatively comprehensive formulary, the Quebec plan. Well, that's pretty good. It's good for people with public coverage. It's better than most provinces provide, but it's about 5,000 drugs on average less than what most private plan beneficiaries enjoy right now. So
Right.
some people will not get access to the drugs that they need. The vast majority will. It's really important to note that probably 80% or 90% of spending is contained within about 800 drugs. Everything else is for very small patient groups, but they need it just as much as you and I might need the very average drugs that we might be taking.
Yeah.
So the assumptions first start with the formulary. They also start with some assumption that there's going to be federal, provincial, territorial cooperation on this, because of course, healthcare is a provincial responsibility.
Mhm.
They also sort of assume that we're going to, on the pricing side, drop immediately to the lowest price of a brand product anywhere in Canada. Okay, that could be done, particularly if there's a regulation around that. But then they assume there's going to be a further 20% cut in all brand name costs for all payers and all patients. That's where the whole thing falls down. There's been this notion of bulk buying. Well, we have a whole lot of volume, we can get much lower prices. That is a good idea. It has some economic theory behind it, but it doesn't work always like that in the real world because there's some point of diminishing returns. I will give you the example of the Netherlands. It's a country with half our population, and its per capita prescription drug spending is also half of Canada's. If
Mm.
bulk buying were a thing, the Netherlands should be paying twice as much as we are, and they're not. So there's other levers that you have, and so that doesn't really work. You can also remember maybe with the Patent Medicine Prices Review Board, they've been through different courts for several
Mm.
years because the brand manufacturers didn't like the policy that was proposed. You could expect nothing less from brand manufacturers if there's an arbitrary 20% price reduction. And the reality too is that the savings that the PBO is now proposing are only about 5% of total spending.
Yeah.
So if you don't get your 20% reduction, and let's say you do get 15%, you've still got no savings. And if
Right.
you don't get 20% at all, then guess what? Every payer, all of your clients know that every year they pay more for drugs, almost no matter what. So there's a lot of
Right.
assumptions in the model. They've assumed that all the drugs no longer eligible under the Quebec plan will suddenly disappear into the ether, or perhaps that the formulary will allow some people to switch over to drugs that will be reimbursed. But there's
Mhm.
no real calculation on that. In fact, they ignored the private payer community entirely in those estimates. So
Yes.
billions more in current spending, no idea what happens to it. So all kinds of
Okay.
challenges around it, and I'm not going to criticize PBO. They were given a model. They had to make reasonable assumptions. This is a starting point for a conversation, but it does show us that we ought to take all models with a grain of salt. As somebody told me once, all models are wrong, but sometimes they're helpful. So let's start with
Right.
the idea this is a helpful start.
Yeah. So complicated. I mean, I wouldn't want the job of trying to figure this out or add up all the
Hmm.
numbers, but it just tells me that it needs a lot more time to be figured out, right? That any sort of immediate response to this that's put out is likely going to be very flawed and very off. So, anyway, with that said, let's finish up. Last question would be if you were recommending to the government maybe what we should do. And I know this comes from some of your background and your opinions on this, but um, if you were advising the government on National Pharmacare, what would you recommend that you think would both work but also be economically feasible?
Right. Right. The costs are important, particularly in this economy, still with high government debts, deficits, higher interest rates, all that. The fiscal issues here matter hugely. Really, in a nutshell, it would be to structure or formalize the existing structure of how people pay for drugs right now, which means a shared cost model between governments, employers, and some out of pocket. Some out of pocket, I think, is reasonable because many people, it's not an affordability issue. Some people will need subsidies. Some people will need some financial assistance. Great. Let's make sure that we help them because it is, in fact, low income people and people in the worst health that consistently report they can't get access to products. They are at least satisfied with both the public and the private healthcare systems. So structure the existing model and then require that coverage be universal. So that might mean that governments pick up all of the costs of the uninsured and the underinsured.
Mm-hmm.
That requires also a national standard, not just for formulary, but also for out-of-pocket costs, so that it wouldn't matter whether you lived in BC or you lived in Nova Scotia or you lived in Ontario. We look after all Canadians here.
Mm-hmm.
So with a shared model, with some protections and standards, with probably some regulation of the private insurance industry, maybe a little like they do in Quebec and have done in Quebec for more than 25 years now, I think insurers can cope with that. And I think we can too. So
Mm-hmm.
I think that there's a way to do this. The costs would be less. Governments would be left with simply, paying for people that don't have enough coverage. There could even be something crazy that employers might provide coverage to part-timers, or all employers would have to provide coverage. Again, a little like the Quebec model. If you've got a benefit plan, you provide drug coverage. These are not big additional costs for employers, but every cost is something that they obviously want to be thinking very closely about and make sure they get good value for it. So there's a lot of other things that would go into this. I could talk about governance. I think governments shouldn't be the only ones managing our drug program. We ought to have other people involved, like other payers, like employers, like insurers, probably health professionals, a number of others. So there's lots that could be done. Most of the things that I want seem like fairly common sense, but they really haven't been studied much by any of the government commissions that have gone into this. And so it's kind of a dark horse. We'll have to see what the legislation presents to us, but I hope that it at least leaves the door open for a reasonable private payer role in a future model of pharmacare.
Yeah, I hope that we can work with it somehow, and whatever comes out. We certainly don't want to have something that really confuses the situation. So I hope that they're considering all this, and as we said, it's very complicated and it requires, in my opinion, a lot more work and study. So patience is my recommendation to government in this regard. So this has been great, Chris. I think our audience will really appreciate how we've sort of framed the key insights or key issues around this topic, at least for now. So thank you for sharing your experience and your wisdom around this. Very helpful. Thank you very much for your time.
Well, my pleasure, and thank you for the opportunity, Roger. It's great to have a chance to talk to people. I hope engage people, because the one audience that really hasn't been engaged so much are employers, and it'd be nice to see them think more about the implications of this for their own businesses and for their own people.
Absolutely. Well said. Okay. Thanks again, Chris.